Hey, this is Travis Gafford, the Doublelift expert, and you're watching Thorn's YouTube channel.
I'm here for another episode of Reflections, and my guest this time is Xpecial, veteran support from North America, has played from Season 1 all the way through to now, in every LCS split as well. So, I actually did an episode of you in the Grilled series, but that is a long time ago now. That's like over 2 years ago. In fact, I think yours was right after Season 3 Worlds. So it was... I want to actually roughly kind of pick up around that point in time, actually, in terms of where I go forwards. But first of all, I have a question that just goes before that, which is one that I feel like you're the ideal person to ask this from. Because here's the thing. When Chaox left TSM, obviously, initially, it's not that there was like bad blood, but initially, people would obviously expect, if you ever downplay anything about Chaox, it'd be just because you're a TSM member. You know, they would think, oh, naturally, you know, maybe there's some hard feelings there, or people want to rationalize that, you know, he's gone, but who cares? But when Chaox left TSM, he unfortunately made that kind of like ill-thought-out statement where he said he was the Season 2 MVP and stuff, which we all know is factually not actually correct, and he's actually mixed up like a community. Like, I think our website had just written that he was the MVP of the regional in Season 2, and he'd somehow just said, I think even he meant that, but he just said Season 2 MVP, which is obviously a ridiculous statement. Like, there's no way he was the best player in all of Season 2. But my question is, most fans, you have to realize, in League of Legends probably only started watching a year ago. You know, they have no clue what we're talking about right now with you and Chaox as the bot lane of TSM in like a very, very successful era. So my question is, being as fair and as balanced as you can on this topic, how good actually was Chaox when you played with him as an AD carrier? What do you think your actual like chemistry between the two of you was like?
Okay, so just to go back to that statement, first of all, that was, I believe, an article by Riot, actually, on like their Law Esports or whatever, and It was like he was MVP for the regionals, you know, like that 2 best out of 3s or whatever. So, I mean, that kind of was there, but obviously that got kind of misconstrued into something really negative that he said later on. So, I mean, that was a mess. But when I played with him, I felt like Chaox was probably top 2 in NA. Him and Doublelift were pretty obviously like the best 2 AD carries. I think that when I was playing with him, we would just kind of survive if needed to, or we could also play aggressive if needed to. And we were very adaptive. We played a lot of different champions, and I think we really worked well together. And I liked him. I liked Chaox.
At the time, I've noticed with all the different AD carries you've played with in your career, you've kind of like had to adapt and have a different kind of style with them all. So what's interesting is at the time, that's one of the reasons I think not a lot of people looked at Xpecial and were like, oh, he's a candidate for one of the best supports. Because at the time, in theory, the person you played with was, it's not that he was like totally passive, but he was more on that end of the scale, you know. It was more like just survive lane, do well in that sense, had the right picks for the comp later on, since TSM was obviously a very good team fighting team. So it means you weren't, also at the time, just for context for people who weren't around, at the time supports didn't get a lot of gold and they didn't have a lot of items either, so it wasn't as easy to just make like crazy plays, you know. What did you actually think of that era of you as a support player? Like, did you actually enjoy playing that start? I mean, in some ways, obviously, when you later got people like WildTurtle and Piglet, you kind of turned loose a bit more to playmake and stuff.
So back then, there wasn't much playmaking stuff in general. I mean, even on champions like Alistar, people didn't really make plays. It was more like Peel was more like a little bit engaged here and there, but generally you didn't really play make that much. I think just the champions in general didn't really allow that. But I think back then for that era, peeling was really, really important with the champions being played, and I was really good at peeling. I felt like I could read situations really well. I could, you know, hold my ultimate if needed. I could, you know, go aggressive if needed, and I think I was pretty good back then. I felt like I've always just been a smart player, so when it came down to having to adapt and whatnot, I could do it quickly because I felt like by playing the game a lot, by understanding the game well, and just by knowing what to do, it just makes things easier.
So when I did that Grilled interview, because it was just after Season 3 Worlds, what people have to realise is that was when WildTurtle was probably at his peak in terms of how people considered like his top level, and he actually had a very, believe it or not, I know a lot of people now think he's like was too aggressive, or they don't think he's like the smartest player. But at the time, he actually had a very good reputation because you guys had done very well in terms of the bot lane performance at Worlds, and that was his first. I mean, he'd only played like 1.5 splits, but you guys had done pretty well in NA overall. So at the time, everyone was like, he's the best NA AD carry. Now, since then, it's been quite a while since people have said that, and a lot of people have a lot of criticisms over the last few years in TSM. So what I want to know is, okay, so that first part of playing with him, things were going really well. The period after Worlds, coming into how you played with TSM in Season 4, still pretty good, but maybe not quite at that level. What was the actual evolution of playing with WildTurtle like? Like, when you got him, was he very different to Chaox? Did you actually like the synergy you had with him? Was it a good setup overall?
So even at that time on the team, we were pretty split on what was actually happening, because when we first got Turtle, he was really, really aggressive. He would play driven, flash in, like he was pretty much the Turtle that you see now, but somehow was working out really, really well. And he would also be very vocal in game. And then as time wore on, he wasn't as vocal. His plays weren't working out as well. He was getting a little too crazy. And we were split on, what exactly was the reason for that. I think what I concluded was just people just got better. People realized that this is how he plays, and just to be more wary of it. But at the same time, they started to adapt to that sort of play style, and Turtle himself just started being less confident. He would talk less. He wouldn't really call it strategy much anymore. And I think it comes with being on a team versus trying out for a team. It's just like the different mentality that you have, where when you're on a team, you don't put everything on the line, but when you're trying out for a team, you try to show 110%.
Do you think that in the latter years, I mean, playing without you, do you think he had some issues? Because, I mean, when I've watched some of those TSM legends, there's some times where the way the kind of team's talking to him, I can't imagine almost any other player being talked to. Like, they're almost basically telling him, like, don't ever flash forwards, never go in with certain ability. You don't normally tell a top player things like this.
I honestly, when I see stuff like that, I just feel bad, because like Turtle is a guy who will very rarely say what's on his mind. He always gives off a super happy-go-lucky personality. That's kind of what you see him and know him for. But he has feelings too, and like he does not like it when people say stuff like that. But I think he also understood that he was making a lot of mistakes, and he himself didn't really know how to fix it. And so when I see that, I'm like, damn, like it sucks that no one can really help him with that. That he has to be resorted to, don't do certain things, like be restricted from flashing. And like I think that's such a silly thing to have to tell somebody, because there's gonna be times when you want to flash in, but the fact that your voice is gonna be in the back of his head, be saying don't flash in, and now everything he does aggressively is gonna be second guessed. So I mean, it sucks for him, but at the same time, I don't really know exactly what happened after I left. I mean, sure, maybe we weren't performing as well or as optimally, even when I was still on the team. But I think a lot of times I would kind of restrain his aggression, but I never really saw it as a huge issue when I was still on the team.
When it came to the circumstances that led to you leaving TSM, like, it was basically said, I think you even talked to this when you came on Summoning Insight, that episode, that it was along the lines of, like, one of the major issues was they wanted something like to be, one of the ways they were trying to improve the professionalism of the team, I've put that in like inverted commas since you can't see me, is like the notion that like you're not allowed to play any other games in the League of Legends. They were kind of trying to be a bit more strict like that. And while I can understand why you tried to do that, because obviously Koreans go even further than that, way further than how strict they are, but it sounded like that's the sort of thing where, I mean, as someone who's a veteran player who's played a long time, this is the sort of thing that wouldn't necessarily vibe with you, because you're like, okay, listen, I'm a professional. I'll play during the time that's practice. I play solo queue even, but when it's my time off, I might play other games. I might play, I don't know what you might play at the time, Hearthstone, Diablo. I don't know what games it was at that specific time. It sounds like that, even if it wasn't that one incident, it sounds like that was the kinds of problems you were having in terms of the friction with the ownership at TSM. Is that reasonable? Yeah,
I think that's pretty reasonable to say. I think I had some thoughts about the game that Reggie didn't agree with at that time, and there's times when nowadays I like, okay, maybe I do agree with that, or I still disagree with that. But the fact is, like, we weren't aligned perfectly, and we just butted heads a lot. And I think the whole benching thing wasn't really meant to be permanent, but I let it go permanent by just being like, I don't want to play. And at the time, I think what I did was fairly reasonable given the information I had, because at the time we didn't have a coach, and I didn't know that we were even looking for one, and I really felt like we weren't getting any direction, and I felt like we were going to get destroyed by Cloud9 over and over. And yeah, I mean, obviously TSM did really well after that, and they got a new coach that worked out for a bit, and then they got a new support, and that worked out as well, and things went good for them.
So, okay, you say that, like, I kind of got the same sense as well, even when it happened, that, like, the idea of this was, it was just a benching in terms of, like, trying to, like, discipline you to make you, like, come in line with whatever they were doing. I mean, if they wanted to kick you out of the team, they could have just done that immediately, But one of the interesting factors was, I remember when it said that you were going to Curse, there was all this stuff implied that, like, Reginald was involved in the deal or something. Now, was he just involved in the deal in as much as, I mean, since you were under contract, someone had to figure out that details, and obviously the owners have to talk to each other in LCS? Or did he, like, specifically just say, right, here you can go to Curse and I can set that up for you, or you have to stay on the bench? Like, did you actually have a choice to go to other teams if you wanted to?
Yeah, actually I did. He pretty much reached out to all the owners that were interested. I think at that time, like, the top teams were CLG, TSM, and Cloud9, and CLG and Cloud9, obviously they had very comparable supports, and they didn't want to go with me, and just the fourth place team was Curse. So I wanted to go to Curse. I felt like they actually had a coach at the time. Like, maybe that wasn't the best idea, but like I felt like that team had really good players. We had they had Quas, they had Dom and Cop. I felt like their players are good enough that if I joined that team, I could help them become a top 3, top 2, top 1 in NA, and that's how I generally felt. But obviously things didn't go as planned, but that was how I felt at the time.
One of the interesting things about when you left TSM is if you look at kind of the role that you were playing within the team at the end of the TSM era, like, you were pretty much almost like the primary engage for most of the team fights. That's the way the team often actually won, either just by pure laning or just winning the team fight outright with fighting. So I could see when you left the team, actually, they always suffered a little bit. Like, okay, Lost Boy eventually was a very good player and integrated in the team, but then, for example, Lost Boy never had, like, amazing English and was never a very vocal player, and you were kind of playing a mini shot calling role. Were you able to take, like, the things that you were doing in TSM there, and do you think that you applied them in Curse? Like, were you more of a shot caller in Curse in that sense? Were you more vocal? Did you want to do those kinds of things?
So because I was joining the team, I kind of wanted to let the team decide how they want to use me. I felt like that was very appropriate. I didn't want to just take over a team and just be like, hey, like, I'm this big shot, like, listen to me. And I didn't want that at all. I wanted to kind of just let things just go the way that the team wants. And I've never been a huge shot caller. I felt like I've always been kind of secondary, because the way I think about things, I think I like to say what's on my mind, but at the same time, I don't ever want to be wrong. So I wouldn't be the one making the calls that would be risky. I'd be the ones being, this is how we rotate, because this is 100% right. This is the best play to go for. And that's kind of the things I would say in game. But at the same time, a shot caller needs to have that element, but also the element of surprise, just like the risky stuff. And I wasn't as good at that, and I never really worked on that. So we just had Dom dominate. He was just the main shot caller for most of the time, because he is somebody that doesn't mind making those calls, and he just worked on it. I don't think I was the main shot caller ever for any team.
So one of the interesting things about the time when you joined Curse is, even though in theory you were leaving one of the absolute best NA teams, and in theory they were the ones, at least initially, with benching you, saying we don't want you to be on a team, it wasn't a circumstance that you were a bad player or that you dropped off or that they even had someone better in line. In fact, we saw initially they had to get Glebe when they were trying to figure out what to do. So what made it unusual is people might not realise, for me, I actually think this was like you were still in your prime at this period of time. Like, I remember that when we went into this phase was every split, because we were already doing Summon and Insight at this point. It was like we'd already had like maybe 4 or 5 months or something. I remember every single split that went by, in fact for maybe like the next 2 as well, we would always be talking through the seasons, like, oh, who are the best supports at the moment? And then I would always be like, well, I've got to go with Xpecial. He's always got the veteran presence, he's played with all these AD carries, he's got the success rate, he always does well in playoffs. And what would happen is every time I'd end up looking really good, because whoever else they'd listed at the time either wasn't in LCS for that long. So, for example, people like Patoy and Bloodboy were pretty good at one point in time, but well, they're not there anymore. Or people like Afromu famously would be amazing in the split, and then in the playoffs they'd always drop off a bit, and actually you'd always have a good performance in the playoffs. What was it? Do you think that was still your prime era, the Illyrian Curse?
Yeah, I think I played pretty well. I think towards the end of that season, the team just didn't work out as well. But I think I still played really well, even on Curse. And I think for a lot of my time on Team Liquid as well, I wasn't playing poorly.
What do you actually think about playing with Cop then? Because obviously, here's the thing about Cop. It's never that anyone said he's, at least as far as I know, no experts ever said he's a bad player. It's just that he really is like, I mean, the joke we always used to make on Summoning Insight is if you could look up in the dictionary, average LCS player, he would be like the picture there, because he always plays exactly the same sort of level all the time. It's not going to be super amazing. He's not going to carry the whole game. It's not going to be super bad. He's just going to kind of do a serviceable job. Is that a reasonable description?
Sure. I think he's also a player that, when motivated, will do really well, but he seems to be really hard to motivate. I think on my time on Curse, I think he by far played the least amount of solo queue out of anybody I've ever seen. It was just kind of ridiculous how little he played, but he would still perform decently well. It's just like, I know he could do better, and I don't think he was just motivated to do so. And it really sucks to see, because I was a player coming from a team where I felt like we needed some breaks, and I see a player where he's taking no time to play the game at all. So it was a really weird transition. I didn't realize how different other teams were. It was my first time not being on TSM. I learned a lot from my experiences on Curse and Team Liquid.
Since when you were in TSM was actually the era when, I mean, admittedly, you were only in TSM for a short while after the odd one had left, but they were kind of transitioning so that they were making Bjergsen the main shot caller. And we've seen that up until them getting Yellow Star now. That was basically the way they've run the team ever since. Because, I mean, obviously, Lost Boy can't call. Santorin and their junglers have always been new people every single split. It makes sense as to why they had to make Bjergsen the shot caller. But it seems to me like the general consensus is it's never been like ideal that he's the shot caller. Like, there's been times when it was good or it worked, but it's never looked to me like he was ever going to be an amazing shot caller, not least because he's an amazing individual player, and that's a carry role, you know. When you played with him, at least, was he already like into this shot calling? What would you evaluate his shot calling? What are your thoughts on it?
So actually, I was never on the team when Odwin was stepped down. He stepped down right after I did.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so I actually never got to play with Amazing. I had no idea that Odwin was stepping down. That was like a whole like kind of a random thing to me. I kind of saw it happening in the next split or so, because just I knew Odwin just didn't he felt like he was holding the team back in some sense, but I got that vibe from him, and he knew that he wanted to retire soon, but I wasn't there when that happened. And as for Bjergsen, I think the reason why he was a shot caller when I was still there was because Reggie was a shot caller and he played mid and Bjergsen played mid, and it was just very natural for Bjergsen to just want to take that spot. I think he was doing fine at it, but he was definitely no high, and I definitely would not blame him for like shot calling issues that we had. I felt like that was a lot of the team mentality, like just not knowing how to play a map correctly.
What do you put that down to? Like, I mean, is it just like lack of coaching and stuff like that?
I think you either have somebody like Hai who can micromanage everything and knew the game at a really deep level, or you have someone else as a coach or an analyst who can help players learn that, and then either those players become like sort of got a mini Hai, or everyone learns it enough so they can all pitch in it enough to not need someone like Hai. I think until Cloud9 really bursted onto the scene, that strategy was not really apparent in North America. It was pretty much just laning until either one team got a big enough lead, or just something happened, a big fight happened, someone takes a lead. It wasn't really strategy involved, I felt like, in NA.
So, okay, when you were in Curse and you were playing in the first lineup that was like Voyboy, it was St. Vicious, it was Cop, a lot of actually players who'd been in Curse quite a while at that point in time. What was actually like in terms of the environment within the team? Because I remember watching a lot of that season. Actually, even though the Curse team didn't end up finishing like super high, like it did pretty decent overall. Obviously, like towards the end of the split, things got really good. You had that good run towards the end where you were beating a bunch of top teams. What was this actually? Oh, this is actually the era when you had I Will Dominate, rather.
Yeah.
In this era, what was the actual shot calling like within Curse? Because that's one thing I never fully. It never seemed like you had a totally designated person who, in all situations, did it. It seems like Owl Dominate tried to grow into it in Team Liquid later, but was there a defined structure in that sense?
No, there wasn't. I think even then, the strategy in NA wasn't really high, so that we would pretty much just lose to any team that had better strategy. Like pretty much Cloud9 all the time. We just could not beat them. I think shot calling was just always kind of the same way when I was on Curse and Team Liquid. Is Dawn would have a lot of the shot calling done, but then I would also be there to support, and just any shot calling that is pretty much rotations or just obvious, like take this turret or back off. Like those are kind of my calls. Dom would just be like the smite stuff, either finish Baron, get off Baron, that sort of thing. And I just always dealt more of vision. It's just kind of how we separated the two things.
In your career, you've always been known as a clutch individual player, and you've always been a part of successful teams. Like, for example, even if TSM didn't win every split, I mean, they made the finals of every split, and they always did have wins over very good teams in the playoffs. Was it shocking to you to lose the third place game of Season 4 that way to the LMQ team, where you guys were leading in the series, and then it fell apart at the end?
I wouldn't say shocking is the right word. I think that when I lost that series, I was sad because I felt like I let a lot of fans down. A lot of fans just like were very supportive and all that. Excuse me. And I felt like, in a certain sense, that we didn't deserve it to go to Worlds, because I felt like we could have worked harder. But that's kind of my mentality, where if I put in a lot of effort, I feel like I deserve to reap a reward. But there are times when I feel like we could have worked harder and we didn't, and so to barely not make it is well deserved, if that makes sense. Okay. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of the reasons why I was so adamant about not having another cop-like situation, because of how we had to deal with just the lack of motivation from a player.
So in Season 5, the big story, I mean, it had already happened, like, I think it was around Worlds even, that maybe this was starting to be rumoured, was like Piglet, former SK Telecom, world champion, was going to Team Liquid. And he obviously was going to be partnered with you since you're the support. Now, it sounds like it actually didn't take very long before the first problems occurred. I mean, I remember there was a scenario where he said something crazy like, I think this might have even been early in the split or before the split, where he said some line that got translated as like, the support is bad. And at the time, obviously, everyone's like, Xpecial is the best support player. So was there? Did you immediately have some sort of friction there with Piglet?
Okay, so first off, I want to reiterate just about Cop. Like, I don't blame Cop at all. I feel like this can easily get misconstrued in that way. But okay. I felt like Cop was good. I felt like he could have been more motivated, and I don't want people to flame him or even flame me, like saying that I blame Cop for that's why we lost. There's something about that at all. I think he played fine in the series, but yeah, just things just didn't work out. And I felt like having motivated players is really important. And regarding Piglet, that's a whole nother can of worms that we're gonna open here. I feel like everything in this video is just gonna come back to bite me in the ass. But okay, here goes. When that happened, I didn't think much of it, because I feel like I could always play better. So if someone tells me that I'm playing bad and they're able to help me with that, I am very grateful. I'm like, that's great. I'm improving. That's what I want to do. But the issue that I had with Piglet was that not only did he not vocalize it to me, he wouldn't vocalize it to management. He wouldn't vocalize it to anybody that could help me or us or the team improve. So it pretty much was kind of, in a way, he would just tell people that I wasn't doing so well, but I wouldn't know. He would be frustrated with my play sometimes, but I wouldn't know. And I'd much rather him be open about it and tell me face to face so I could work on it. There was a time when I was extremely upset. I was after some scrims. I was straight up just crying. Like, I was bawling my eyes out because I felt like we weren't improving as a bot lane, and I felt like Piglet didn't want to improve. And I cared so much about winning that to see a player that I felt like was good, is motivated, but isn't really willing to help the team improve, it just like it finally broke me. Like I was just so upset, and that was an instance. I don't remember when, but I just remember that as being a really key moment for me, and I felt like we got a little better after that, but things weren't ever perfect.
Since obviously he himself had his issues in Season 4 when SK Telecom had struggled, and a lot of people actually blamed him for that, because famously at the regionals for Korea he'd done very badly, and I think it was after regionals, I think it was an NLB tournament or something, he'd had a very bad stats in. So people felt like, okay, even though he has the stature of a world champion, he himself needed to change when he came to NA. One of the things people have often said is after they saw the issues he had with you and adapting to getting good in NA, which still took him a few months, people said, okay, well, maybe looking back, Pumandu played more of a role than we know. Like maybe that guy was not just his support, he was kind of like a guy who knew his personality, or knew kind of like how you have to like work with Piglet to make him successful. I mean, does Piglet need a very specific type of player with him, or a very specific sort of personality, do you think?
So it's really hard for me to talk about this openly, because I feel like things that Piglet tells me, things that people that knew Piglet told me, like those things I feel like should not be public, because it really tarnishes a lot of the reputations of players, and or even maybe bolsters them. There's things that I cannot say.
Okay.
But as for Piglet, I think that he's a player that really needs someone harsh, not as a support player necessarily, but as a coach. I think someone needs to really like tie him down and be like, Piglet, like this is what you need to do, and be authoritative. And I think it's very, very goes hand in hand in creating culture, where if you're older or you have respect or you have a reputation and you have the respect of someone else, they're going to listen to you. I think we really lacked that during my time on Team Liquid. We didn't really have anybody that can control him. Our coach, Peter, I liked Peter a lot. I felt like he was really smart, but he lost a lot of motivation, and he was very frustrated with Piglet, and he couldn't command his respect at all, because not only was he younger than Piglet, Piglet also felt that he wasn't good enough.
So this will sound weird because, okay, on one hand, when I say that Piglet didn't really make much of an effort to learn English, like, I mean, I actually went over to LA in I think it was in a few weeks, maybe like the second week of the summer split of this year, and I tried talking to him, and he still basically could understand almost nothing, and people had to like translate things to him. Again, still very limited English. So on one hand, yeah, it's obvious he didn't put a lot of effort in there, and he's probably never going to be really good at English at this rate of how his life's going. Okay, but on the other hand, I also kind of get it that, like, if you haven't learned any English language skills and you just move to professionally play a game, which is going to take all your time up, I mean, where are you going to get the time to learn what might be a very difficult second language? Was that an issue though? Like, is the fact that in theory the person you're playing with in the bot lane, I mean, as a result, like, did you actually have some like basic system in place? Did you have to like kind of just play intuitively off him? Like, how did you overcome that? Because obviously during the summer split you guys became pretty good.
Yeah, honestly, I didn't feel like there was any issues with our laning, but his English wasn't bad. It wasn't bad enough for league, at least. It was good enough. He because Korean champions, the way they say it, and English is exactly the same. There was no issues there. And then stuff like back off, Baron, Dragon, those are very simple things that he pretty much knew the moment he got here. Like these are things that they even use in Korea. Like they're similar phonetically, and there were no issues there. I felt like there wasn't any issues when it came to communicating simple communication, at least in our games. I mean, there were times when we couldn't like be like flank here, like back off, like more complex stuff, but like that stuff didn't really work out. And obviously at a game it was hard to communicate, but if he wanted to communicate something in game, generally we wouldn't have too much trouble.
Okay, what did you actually think of his level in the summer?
I felt like he played really well. I think obviously there were some games he didn't play as well, but he definitely improved a lot from his spring split, and he was definitely a top 280 carry in summer split overall.
The general consensus is that things were still pretty good with you through the spring split, but most people think in the summer split you fell off. Like you had some sort of issues individually. Is this how you see things?
I definitely can see why people think that, and in some ways I agree. I think there are times when I didn't play so well. I think it's very easy to point out plays that I made in the summer split that were horrible. Versus
people always say Urani was problematic.
Exactly, but I mean, in the end, that was one game that I didn't perform so well, and honestly, I felt like my level wasn't drastically off. So if you said that my spring split was my 9, I would say my summer split was like a 7.5 to an 8. So not better, not even the same, but a little bit worse. And it comes down to like the mistakes I made were just so bad and so apparent. So the big instance I remember was there was a flash over the second tier purple side, like that wall, whatever, and I missed the flash, and that caused me to panic and miss my ult as well, and that just looked awful, right? Like stuff like that stuff I've never made before, and people just thought, oh wow, this guy's past his prime. And then right after that, I made a play mid where I tried to ult, and I felt like that wasn't even that bad, where I missed my ult on Annie, but it was because I was against Orianna, where I knew that if I stepped a little bit closer to guarantee an ult landing, I would get blown up instantly. So I wanted to get a max range ult. If I landed, great. If I don't, then we'll just wait for cooldowns. And I didn't have flash, so that was just my mentality. I guess overall, I'm just not a player that really looks at mistakes and be like, okay, I'll that was awful, but I'm not gonna try to avoid everything I can to not repeat that. I'm just gonna try again, and that was my mentality. Like, sure, that was a bad play, but I don't want to make another bad play. There's a good chance that play can turn out great.
Do you think that when you were in Curse, at Liquid rather, and the other Korean obviously that was brought into the team was Fenix. Now he's someone where all the players in the NA scene, probably even to this day, still said like, oh, in scrims he's amazing, like he just wrecks people, he's so good. Now obviously, especially in the summer split, he started to do some of that stuff in actual LCS games, and he had some big games, and he had some very good games obviously on Azir. Does he still suffer from some sort of issue transitioning his scrim play into his official play?
So I think when it comes down to scrim versus LCS, is just how aggressive you can actually play. In LCS, people play a lot more back, and it's hard to punish. It's hard to kill them. It's there's more jungle pressure in play. But in scrims, you can just go super ham, and if you call your jungler there, you'll typically get kills because the enemy mid laner might not be playing as aggressive. And it's the same thing for bot lane as well. It's just some players play extremely aggro in scrims, but just completely play differently in LCS. And I think Fenix suffered from that a little bit, where he kind of was the opposite, where he played too aggressive in LCS, and he would just get ganked or get killed, or he tried to pressure, but he would misplay and then get ganked, and it's just he would just try too hard. I felt like if he loosened up a little bit, played more smart and more vision based, and he would have just done 10 times better. And he sort of did that towards the end of summer split, but it took him a long time to really get to that point.
So one of the big disappointments of the last split was that obviously at one point in time you guys were like right near the top of the table towards the end of the split. Things had gone really strong. Not only did you lose the playoffs, but because of the new qualification system, you guys were like the final bosses at the end of the gauntlet. And this Cloud9 team that you faced you were supposed to beat them, because I mean this was a team that was still even figuring shit out. You could tell like High still didn't have his jungle pool in place. They had a lot of issues going on, but they managed to beat you in that final of the qualifier. What do you think went wrong at the end for Liquid that stopped you guys making this Worlds?
Well, I'll say from my perspective, I think the biggest thing that happened was after a loss. I think it would be considered the semifinals against TSM. Was it TSM? Yep. Yeah, TSM. Yep. We were so heartbroken. We felt like we had practiced so hard, and we just got out strategized. We felt like we were destroying TSM in lanes. We would be up so much CS, like 2k, 3k just off laning alone, which is insane. It should never happen, and we still lose a game. We felt like our strategy was just completely off. So we were significantly ahead in lane in ways that honestly shouldn't ever happen in pro play, and we still somehow lose those games. And we were so frustrated that our strategy we felt like was what was holding us back so much, and it was an issue that we couldn't solve the whole season, that we kind of like lost our purpose in scrims. We didn't really see the point if we couldn't even do anything. Like if our scrims weren't able to improve the areas that we were the worst in. And we still skimmed a bit from MSG. We still got better as a team, but after that, we were pretty heartbroken. Just the fact that we felt like we worked so hard for pretty much a whole year and we couldn't improve in the areas that we needed help the most.
When your team had the problems in the playoffs and then in this regional, this is actually a time when, because I'd looked at your lineup and I thought, right, this lineup has so many skilled players across the positions. Obviously, it was doing very well at one point in time. I was like kind of looking, like trying to piece together what are some of the problems the team had here. And aside from things like, there's Koreans playing and maybe don't have amazing English, one of the things I kind of honed in on is I was like, I don't think the style of this coach fits this team, actually. Like, when I looked at, like, the style of even how he'd pick bands sometimes, or the style of how it seemed like the team played, it seemed like, here's the thing, I've never said that Pete is a shit coach. It's more like, I just think that you have to have the right coach for the right team. So when I look at his old team, the LMQ team, it makes sense as to why he's that sort of coach. Like, if you put him on a team where their whole aim is to just get to the mid-game and team fight, I think he would probably be a good coach. But when I look at the Team Liquid team, when your guy's strength was amazing laning, getting ahead so often, having these individual players, but then things always fell apart in the mid game in the games you would lose, and there was some, like, the shot calling wasn't very good. That's one of the reasons I was quite critical of that. And here's the thing, when I did this initially, some people were like, oh man, you're being too harsh on him, like, maybe we just don't understand things behind the scenes. But after I'd actually made these statements, I'll just say that I heard from a few Liquid players, they didn't necessarily disagree with what I was saying. Like, they thought, yeah, there are kind of some issues here, and maybe things aren't suited, and if we could go back in time, we would definitely do them differently. What is your thoughts on this topic? Because obviously the coach now is a very big part of teams.
Okay, so it's honestly, there's a lot of ways to look at it. I think the way I approach it is that a lot of the picks and bans that we did weren't just Peter. There was an analyst involved, there were players involved. Like, we didn't pick and ban because Peter wanted it, or because Piglet wanted it, or because I wanted it. It was because the team agreed that that's what we wanted to do. And when people always say, like, oh, why do you put Quas on tanks? Well, to be frank, he was fine with that, and he wasn't always performing so well on carries. Like, he had games that he did well in, but overall, our most consistent games were just because we had Quas on tanks, and that's what we felt was our issue as well, consistency. And we didn't want to keep putting players on risky champions where we can just put on safe champions and just be more consistent overall. I don't really know if you can really just blame Peter for this. Like, I know that a lot of the players were divided on, who was the issue, or like where did it go wrong. But I felt like we tried. I felt like with the information that we had, with the games that we played, that we tried with the best of our knowledge.
Was he actually the right sort of coach, though? What do you think on that aspect? Like, stylistically, did he come in with the right sort of vision for how the team would run?
I don't think that's even a question that I can answer, just because I felt like towards the end, it wasn't even he wasn't even really the coach in terms of he had control of almost anything. Everything just was like a democracy in a way, okay, where he had to be like, okay, let's put it up for voting. Yes, no, like, that was kind of how it was. It wasn't
that
like
problematic. Like, would it have been better if he'd okay, that's actually something, this isn't something I actually have quite a strong opinion on. I always think with a coach, even if it doesn't work, in a way it's better to give him a little bit more authority, because then it's kind of, at least he got to do his plan, Then if it didn't work, it was his plan, it didn't work. Was that an issue? Do you think that it became a democracy?
Again, it's hard to say, because I think we did give him some room, but I think that some of the players weren't always on board, and it made it really difficult to work when we had just so many different strategies that people want. Sometimes, Peter would have an idea, and then we'd go with the idea, but we ended up not using the idea. It was really a mess. I felt like we had, even though we had coaches and we had like a support staff, I didn't really felt like we did. I felt like a lot of times we went in not knowing what the hell we're doing, and I felt like that was a pretty big issue with the team.
So one of the things about Liquid and Curse, and the owner, Liquid112, Steve, is I've actually always kind of been impressed by the fact that he has done a pretty good job over his time in LCS of getting like big names, like getting star names. He obviously had like St. Vicious, Voyboy, Xpecial, Quaz at some point in time was considered a very highly touted amateur player. Got Piglet eventually. I mean, Fenix wasn't really like a superstar name at the time, but eventually became a star player. So in terms of just like loading the teams with like big names, he did a good job. But it is true, his teams never qualify for Worlds, and they always tended to, like, even if they were good, they would tend to level out at around a third or a fourth type place. What do you think on this topic? Like, is there anything to this pattern? Like having all this talent but never really ever fully getting like the great team together?
I mean, there's no holy grail answer to this. I wish I knew. Otherwise, I mean, if I did, then probably, we'd be first place or whatever. I don't know. There's always something wrong, and each split's different, and it's always super close, and that's so frustrating when you have teams like Dignitas where they just never do well, beyond like a couple games, and they're never able to go to Worlds, but nobody expects them to. But then you have Liquid, who everyone always expects to do well, but never does. And I don't know which one's better, but it's just how it is. I don't really have an answer. I guess it's always maybe just when you bring in so many big names who have large egos, possibly myself included, that makes the team hard to work with. I don't know. I don't know which pieces are broken and which pieces are actually working out, but it just never has worked out.
So you said the bit before where you set the context of how you left TSM. Like, for example, at the time you didn't have a coach. Like, it wasn't known that Odd1 actually would immediately step down like that. You initially were probably benched just for like actually a benching. Like, you'd come back into the lineup again probably. There was all these circumstances around it where it's hard to know what the future would have been either way. Even if you'd left, you probably didn't quite know what to expect, and if you'd have stayed, you wouldn't know what to expect. But in light of how the Curse and Liquid period went, I'm not saying do you like regret playing for those teams. I'm sure when you were in the teams, you were like committed to trying to make it to Worlds and stuff. But when you look back now, if you could go back in time, would it have been the right decision to try and stay at TSM? Would you have accomplished more?
So I think it's very obvious to say that I would have accomplished more. I probably would have gone to Worlds. We probably would have finished second or maybe first at split. I think it's a very fair thing to say, because I don't think that Lesbo and I were there's this huge skill gap where I felt like he wasn't like he was way better than me or anything like that. So I felt like we would have done that. But at the same time, I've actually learned a lot, like just playing on a different team. You learn a lot more about how teams work. I learned a lot more about myself, what kind of player I am. And I guess in a way my growth was limited playing for TSM because I've been playing for them for so long. And I felt like in a way I also kind of got complacent with my spot. And I really grew out of my shell as well, just because I was forced to interact with more players and just do things I would not have ever done on TSM. And at this point, I think it's silly to regret it, but I definitely think that professionally I would have gone further. But personally, from just a life standpoint, doesn't really matter. I feel like life happens. You make mistakes. You choose the wrong path sometimes, but it still worked out in the end. Like, I'm not exactly dead or anything like that. Like, I'm still alive, so I'm fine with that.
Since you've played a long time, like you've played every single LCS split, and you've been playing since Season 1 actually, that sort of a player, there's not that many of them still around who are fully active, and especially not that many who are the top level. Like, there's rare exceptions where they are, like someone like Xpecial who can still be very good, etc. It's not very often that's the case. So if you came out today and you just said, right, you know what, I'm retired, the playing part's over, no one would be shocked. Like, everyone would be like, okay, makes sense just in terms of how long you've played. Also, like, the last split obviously is probably your worst split, so the people are like, okay, the pieces are kind of in place. But it was implied when you left Liquid, and it was implied with your vlogs, that right now that's not necessarily what you're thinking. You're not necessarily thinking to retire, and at least you're open to the notion of see if you can get a good team, see the right opportunity. So in light of the fact you can't tell us which team you're going to go to, is it the case that is there something you still have to accomplish in your career? Are you someone who just wants to be a pro and that's just a life you want to do and that's just your job? How do you kind of see the future for Xpecial in that sense?
I think it's two reasons. I think the first reason is that I felt like my last split was so unfair. I think that if the whole retirement or the whole benching thing, whatever, was not leaked and it was more of I'm choosing to retire, I might have done things differently. But because of the way that it went about, and it just made me look so bad, I felt like I don't want that to be my lasting image. I wanted it to be good. Like, I felt like my last split wasn't that bad, but because of all this negative press surrounding it, it made it seem worse than it actually was. And I was really frustrated with that. And I did want to prove myself, but at the same time, I was okay with going to the wayside because I felt like I've been playing for a really long time. And then people always ask me year after year, how long are you gonna play? And I always say a year or 2 years ago. This is like 3 years ago, even. Like people ask me how long you're gonna play, and I was okay with the idea of stepping down permanently. But I decided against it, and I think I made my choice. With all the stuff that's happened, I don't think this. I don't feel like I want to go down like this. I want to have another split, another season, maybe 2 seasons, 3 seasons. I don't know, where I show people, look, I wasn't bad. Maybe I had some bad games, but I'm still good, and I want that to be my lasting image.
So ever since the Season 3 All-Stars, a famous storyline that always seems to go away and then everyone remembers about it every now and then when there's roster possibilities is like what would have happened if Xpecial and Doublelift had played together. Because, I mean, you saw Doublelift was still like an MVP candidate last season. Obviously, you're two of the only players who've been both really good at your positions in NA and have endured so many seasons. Now, as I asked you before where I said, like, was there options aside from going to Curse? I mean, you said, like, okay, maybe CLG wasn't an option because they had Afrim at the time who was doing quite well. But there have been times, I've heard behind the scenes, there have been times in both of your careers where, for example, Doublelift could have joined TSM, you could have joined CLG. Admittedly, at the time, the one that makes more sense to me is why you didn't join CLG, because this is when you were on TSM and you were in a better team, so I can get that one. The one that I don't get as much is the fact that Doublelift would never leave when some of his teams weren't so good. If it had ever actually happened, is it something that you ever actually... Was there ever a period in time where you wanted it to happen? Where you thought, oh, this would be interesting if it happened? Was there a reason why you would or wouldn't have wanted it to happen?
I think it would have been very interesting. I think a lot of times back then, especially, people were really blinded by friendship. It kind of sucks to say, but oftentimes when you want a player, it's not just this player. It's they come bundled with another player, and maybe you don't want that other player. And that's kind of the issues that have always came back in those seasons. Is just star players, they want to bring their friends along. And that's not how teams really work. You don't just get to choose, half the team just because you're really good. And yeah, there were definitely times when I could have joined CLG and times that he could have joined TSM. And I think a lot of those times it made sense. I think it would have made for some really, really scary bot lanes, but never really happened. And yeah, but much as how couple weeks ago people were so surprised about TSM Doublelift, that could have been a thing 2 years ago. That would have been exactly the same, I guess.
Okay. After all the different AD carries you've played within your career, like different styles, some of them even different countries they're from, totally different mentalities to the game, have you figured out, is there like a preferred style of AD carry for you? Like if you were kind of like building the ideal AD carry, not in terms of actual players, but just the qualities that they'd have, what would the best fit for Xpecial be, or what would you fit best to?
Honestly, if you had asked me this before Piglet, I would have given you a completely different answer, because I felt like I've always been a player that try to adapt. I try to, be smart about the game, like play the best way possible. And what I've come to realize is that even I have a style that I prefer, even if I maybe might just be playing better with. And I think that style is just talkative. It's not even a style. It's just like this is a player that knows what they're doing and is willing to be vocal and be just willing to improve. I don't think it's a necessarily style thing, but it's just, okay. Let's rewind a little bit. So I like aggressive styles. I like farming sometimes. I think it's just a player who can play like I do, but at the same time be willing to adapt to me as well, and I'm willing to adapt to them. It's kind of a weird answer, but I guess I haven't really thought about it like that. But it's just, I feel like I can adapt, but I feel like the other person has to be willing to accept it. Does that make sense?
Okay, so when I think back to like Season 2 Xpecial, when TSM was winning all those lands, like I mentioned earlier in the interview, people have to understand if they weren't around back then. You can't necessarily judge like a playmaking of a support, because again, he has no gold, he's placing wards all the time, and at the time, the champion pool, there was no Thresh at the time, okay? So unless you're like Mad Life and you can get away with playing Blitzcrank, odds are you're not going to be making mad plays and stuff. So at the time, when I think of a lot of the Season 2 supports, unfortunately, I always just remember everyone picking Sona and just playing that. And obviously, that's not the most cool champion to watch. That's like a very great supportive champion, but it's never going to make the player look amazing playing Sona. But then later in your career, obviously you did become very well known for your Thresh. You would play these engaged champions. You'd play Annie. You'd play stuff like this. Leona. But I notice in the latter era, you've actually now been going back to some of the more supportive players. You've been playing Janna a lot more. You've been playing Braum. What do you actually think of, in your mind, if you had to pick one champion that you mastered the most? Like which do you think you have the best control overall? It was just it fit your approach the best. Who would you pick?
This is gonna be a big surprise, but I think Janna. And the reason for that is because she is very timing based. She has some control in terms of engages, and her builds are all over the place. You can build very supporty. You can build very utility based. Like there's that. Her laning is good, not great, but if needed, you can farm out. But at the same time, you can still play aggressive. And her ult is very strong. And there's multiple ways to use it. You can use it aggressively. You can use it defensively. You can use it for the healing. And I think Janna has so much potential and so many ways to think about it that when I'm playing Janna, I'm not thinking about, she's one of the easier support champions, but there's so much you can do with her that you can't do with a lot of other champions. And that's why that's a champion that I've always kind of felt like really comes to me, but a lot of times I can't play it because Janna is a champion that really requires a really mechanically good AD carry, because without a mechanically good AD carry, you're not going to be able to build a lead. You can't really like the shield isn't strong enough to win a lane by yourself. You need your AD carry to assist you. And for a long time, I just couldn't really play Janna because it's hard to find a really good AD carry sometimes. Okay,
so then along similar lines then, after all the years and all the metas you've played with AD carries, is there like an AD carry that throughout history, like this is like the one that was always the favourite for you to play with, or just the one that always seemed to work out the best if you were playing with this AD carry? Like their champion this is?
People ask me that question all the time. And I mean, part of it is that I don't want to offend anybody, but it's also that it's a really hard question. I think I've played with so many different AD carries in different eras. That
I mean the actual champion that
their champion.
Like, is there an ideal champion that you look back and you go, that was always like the one that worked best with, or I think I play off that champion so well?
I mean, Kalista, I guess, it's really the only champion that affects me directly. Is that what you mean, or do you mean something else?
Because I just want to know which one you like the best over history.
I just think every support player is just going to say Kalista, because Kalista is just like the only champion where you basically get an extra ability. No other champion has that. And yeah, so Kalista is like by far just like the most fun to play with. You can dominate lanes. You have an extra flash engage ability. Like it's just, she does so much things that she allows for your support to do. And yeah, Kalista is really fun. But just throughout history, like in general, I mean, just AD carries generally have been the same, honestly. You have sustain damage, and then you have the burst champions. And there's kind of those two categories. You don't really have anything else.
What did you think of the era when people started trying to force Urgot AD carry to be played all the time? You fine with that? For me, it's kind of like an abomination of what AD carry is supposed to be.
Oh my god, that reminds me of, what is it, the Mordekaiser. Like, that stuff, I don't know, like, yes, maybe you can mix things up once in a while, right? But, like, please stop bringing in 80, like, the melee shit. Like, I don't want to see them. They're not fun. Urgot, yeah, he's ranged, but he's ugly. He's not fun to play against. You can't really kill him. Like, he has no counterplay. That shit's either broken or really, really weak. And I hate that. I'd much rather have AD carries be really similar to each other and have outplaying potential versus literally either pick Urgot or ban him, or else you're going to be dealing with like a Soraka sort of situation where like there's nothing you can do except farm. If that's the bot lane situation, I'm going to cry. Like Soraka should just be the leader from the game, because that's pretty much what Urgot is for sports.
If at any point in history, it can be any season, you could have played with one European player. It doesn't have to be an AD carry, it can be any position in the game. You can have this European player come over and he'd be on your team. Is there someone who stands out? Like someone where it's like, I'd love to play with that guy, or he'd work really well on a team with me?
I wouldn't really be able to say for any role other than AD carry. And I felt like Reckless has always been a player that I've really respected in terms of play. He gets a lot of shit sometimes from players being like, "Oh, he's too passive" or whatever. I think you two actually give him a lot of shit for that.
Yeah, I do.
Yep. But I see him as a really mechanically strong player, can play a lot of champions, and I think like him being able to play that style really well works with my style of being able to adapt to that really well. It kind of reminds me of Chaox, but probably more modern, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that okay, here's a question I have then actually along those lines. So one of the things I've always wondered about with Reckless, because I don't know him personally, so I can't ask him this directly. I've always wondered, is that actually his preferred style? I mean, it seems at times like it has been, like he wants to play that more like just farm out style and just be the like guy on the outside of the team fight doing basic cleanup damage. It seems like sometimes he goes towards that, but I've also sometimes wondered if he just needed like the aggressive support to unlock the other side of him. Like maybe someone could actually like get him to play the hard carry style sometimes. What do you think on that? Do you have an opinion?
I don't think so. I think his style is perfectly fine for the game. It's just very consistent. You're never going to see him do horrible. He's always going to do good or better. And maybe, yeah, it's maybe probably the team, but at the same time, I feel like AD carry shouldn't be a role to carry in from laning. Like, just because you have someone like Doublelift doesn't mean like you have to win your lane every single time. I think being able to just go even or win your lane, kind of like a sneaky situation. I'd much rather have someone like Sneaky over most of the AD carries in North America, even though maybe their highs are higher. But then the fact that their lows are lower is a huge turnoff for me. I'd much rather just have consistency or above.
Okay, so at the end of the interview, do you have a final message for people who watch the interview? Like maybe just about your career or where you see yourself going or what you think at the moment?
Well, I have so much on my mind. I've been like just dealing with so much crap, just whether it's off season or just like personal situations. I think I'm just really excited for the new season. I just want to have a fresh slate to work with, and I really want to show off, just be like, hey guys, you guys have been supporting me for a really long time, and I'm going to show you why your trust wasn't misplaced. And I just want to be the Xpecial that everyone knows me for, and not the Xpecial that people see me, maybe even wrongly, towards the end of last split. And just definitely just like a shout out to all you guys. Really appreciate the fact that you're even watching this hour-long interview or reflections is pretty outstanding. So I think that's it.